Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of February of 2023. Sorry for so late updates, today on the 8th of February is my birthday, so I was a little bit busy. So now let's discuss the situation in Ukraine. First of all, we're going to talk about the progress on the ground, and we're going to talk a lot about the towns and the numbers and so on. I believe you've heard that, according to the Russian sources, the Russians managed to enter Sinkovka and to push the Ukrainians back from this area, but it is not true. When talking about the real situation, according to Sinkovka, this town is in the gray zone. The Ukrainians did really left this town, and I believe that now they're located on the north of Kupiansk. This town is in the gray zone. The Russians haven't entered this town yet, but I believe they will do this in the next few days, but this town is still in this gray zone. When talking about Kupiansk area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours they managed to kill, or the Ukrainian losses were around 35 soldiers and around 2 armored vehicles, but there are no changes on the ground. When talking about Lyman frontline, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian losses were around 130 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system. As you can see, the losses among the Ukrainians are very high. I believe that during the previous few days you heard, and I was talking about this as well, that the Russians returned control over Bilogorovka or some part of Bilogorovka, but this is not true. The Bilogorovka, this town still remains under Ukrainian control. Furthermore, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reported or included information about Shipilovka that during the previous 24 hours they managed to repulse the Russian counteroffensive or offensive operation in the vicinity of Shipilovka. So that means that Bilogorovka is still under Ukrainian control. When talking about Lyman frontline, one more time, the Ukraine lost around 130 soldiers. So as you can see, the clashes all over the front lines are very heavy and the losses are very high. When talking about Sporne, about this area, I believe that today, during this day, you heard that the Russians managed to establish control over Sporne and that they entered this town, but this is not true, or at least it's just a small part of this information, this piece of information was true or something like this. The Russians haven't entered Sporne. According to the Russian information, they managed to establish control maybe they managed to go as close as possible to this town. Still, the Ukrainians are able to keep some places or some streets in this town. I believe that within the next few days, the Russians will be able to complete the clearing operation and so on. But when talking about the current situation, Sporne is still under Ukrainian control, not under the Russian control. When talking about the front line, let's start from Bandarinka, Vasyukovka, Razdolovka, Veselaya, and let's say Vyimka. This territory is still under Ukrainian control. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to develop some progress, but when talking about the global scope, they haven't established control over a single town this area, just a few checkpoints and so on. When talking about the north of Bakhmut or Artyomovsk, I believe that today you heard that the Russians managed to establish control over Krasnaya Gora, but this is not true. The Russians still haven't established control over Krasnaya Gora. I believe that by the end of this day they control maybe around 90% of this town. And if you remember, yesterday we discussed this area, and if you remember, I told you that they control the eastern part, this residential area where we can find the very small buildings. Maybe during the previous 24 hours they managed to establish control over the central part, but when talking about this defense line, or about these big buildings and the industrial zone on this bottom, the Russians haven't established control over these two territories. So for now, the Ukrainians, yes, they control just around 10 or maybe 5% of this small town, but they control the most important part of this town. And when talking about Russian progress, as I told you, I believe that to take control over these two areas, to take control over these 5% of Krasnaya Gora, I believe that they need to spend energy, more energy than they spent to establish control over the previous 95%, because this is the most important town. So Krasnaya Gora still under Ukrainian control, or at least is its western part the most important part. I'm not saying that the Russians are not able to take this town, but I believe that within a few days they will do this. When talking about the south of Bakhmut, about Ivanovsk and so on, I believe that you heard that the Russians managed to establish control over the road T0504 over this line, but it's not true. I believe that there are some recon combat or some commanders groups who are able to get as close as possible to this road, but this road still remains under Ukrainian control. Yes, the Russians established control over checkpoints in front of Ivanovskaya, they got as close as possible and so on, but they still have a lot of job to do. I'm not saying that the Russians are not able to do this. Yes, they will, but within the next few days, but not today. When talking about entire Donetsk front line, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost around 140 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system. Furthermore, the Ukrainians lost around 2 ammo depot in this area. When talking about Donetsk itself, as we know, there are very heavy clashes in Marinka and so on, and if you remember, yesterday we discussed that the Russians promised to establish control over entire Marinka within the next few days. Furthermore, some Russian sources were reported that the Russians achieved some success and maybe they have established or ruined the entire Marinka, and there's just a question of maybe hours to complete the liberation of Marinka, but it is not true. The Russians just managed to cross the central part to establish control over the main street in the middle of this town. Yes, there are ruins on the western part, but there are still Ukrainians in this area. The Russians have progress, and I believe that within the next few days the Russians will be able to take control over this town, but not today. When talking about Vuhledar, there are very heavy clashes in this area. The Ukrainians started their own counter-offensive operation, but the main problem when talking about the Ukrainians is that during the preparation process of defense line in this area, they mined completely every single square meter around Vuhledar, and the Russians reported that while making some attempts of counter-offensive operation in this area, the Ukrainians got on their own mines, and they lost a lot of armored vehicles and tanks and were forced to step back on the Vuhledar front line. So that's why it's very difficult to start offensive operation from both sides. As I understand, the Russians still control the south part of Vuhledar, southeast. They have 100% over the residential area between Pavlovka and Nikolska and so on. But we can't say that the Russians have significant positions in this area. They have controlling Vuhledar and so on. No, it's not true. When talking about South Donetsk area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 75 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles in this area. When talking about Orekhov, there are no changes in this area, just the artillery duels without any progress on the ground. When talking about Kherson, we can say about the same thing, just artillery duels without any progress on the ground. So as you can see, the previous 24 hours were very important for the Russians, very important, because today you heard from my words that the Russians, we heard a lot of updates about taking control of many towns, but that was some kind of speculation. The Russians haven't established control over every single town we discussed, but they have significant progress in those towns, and I believe that within a few days they will establish control over Krasnaya Gora. They will push the Ukrainians back from Bilogorovka. They will complete the clashes around Sporne. The Russians will push the Ukrainians on Zhiribets River and so on, but this is going to happen within the next few days, and these directions maybe are not the most important. The most important area these days is the area around Krasnaya Gora. And I told you very interesting piece of information about this area. If you take a look at that map, disposition map, you're gonna see that there is a very important update around the north of Bakhmut, and I'm talking about this 30th Mechanized Brigade. As you can see, this is a very fresh update according to this map. This brigade have been recently deployed in this area, and it's true, it's completely fresh forces that were deployed during the previous few days. But the thing is that the Ukrainian sources are saying that the Ukrainians deployed this fresh brigade that were fulfilled with the newly mobilized forces, but the Ukrainians are saying that these brigades were deployed without any ammo or any even bullets for tanks or artillery or just for soldiers. So that was completely empty brigade. Of course, they had some depots, some had some resources to fight, to stand against the Russians and so on. But the Ukrainian sources confirms, and the Russian sources are saying that that was some kind of like fake brigade on this area. The Ukrainian commanders, according to information we have, ordered these brigades to deploy their forces near Blagodatne to stop the Russian progress in this area between Zeleznyansk and Blagodatne, and these brigades were deployed, but they didn't have any ammo. And they had, but the amount of weapon they had was so low, so they couldn't stand against anything. Just a regular infantry brigade are able to penetrate the defense orders of this 13th Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of Zeleznyansk. And the Ukrainians are saying that that brigade stood on this position, and as soon as they saw the Russians, they dropped their position and ran away as far as possible. So this is the reason why the Russians managed to develop progress and bridgehead in the vicinity of Blagodatne. And now, when talking about Paraskoviivka and Krasnogora, you see that when talking about Bakhmut, we know about operational encirclement, that the Russians are planning to encircle this town. And as you can see, they're attacking in the direction of Ivanovska. They're trying to develop their offensive operation in the direction of Stupki, Krasnaya Gora. And we can say that, and a lot of sources are saying that Bakhmut is encircled in around 75%. But when talking about Paraskoviivka and Krasnogora, you're going to see that this town is encircled for more than, I believe, 80%. So it's also a small encirclement. It's also a small cauldron. And the Russians these days, these hours, are trying to encircle the Ukrainian garrison in Paraskoviivka and Krasnogora. Let's return back to the Western sources map and let's try to update this map just to understand. Oh, furthermore, as you can see now, the Western sources map is completely updated, and you can see and I can see, and you can see that there is a cauldron. It's a cauldron. It's a classic cauldron in Paraskoviivka and Krasnogora. The Ukrainians have been encircled in Paraskoviivka and Krasnogora. Let's update this map according to information we have. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that they they establish control over the north part of Stupki railroad station. So it's very important update. And when talking about this area, yes, the Ukrainians still have control, or they have control over the road TO5 or over the road MO3, this one. But as you can see, this road is under complete Russian control, fire control, and so on. So this is a classic encirclement. Yes, the Ukrainians do have position to use this road in direction of Dubovo-Vasilievka. But when talking about this area, these roads are not leading the Ukrainians anywhere. These roads goes to fields. These roads the Ukrainians are using not to move from Paraskoviivka in direction Dubovo-Vasilievka. The Ukrainians uses these roads to move from Dubovo-Vasilievka in direction of Bakhmut and then in direction of Chasov Yar. So this is encirclement. The Ukrainians can run away from one corner to another, but it doesn't change the real picture. So this is the situation, and this is the most important area. The Russians managed to develop significant bridgehead in this area, and the main reason, as I told you, the Ukrainians deployed 13th Mechanized Brigade without any ammo, support, and supply. So it was completely empty brigade, and their main mission was just to show their faces. And I believe they supposed, and maybe they thought, that just by showing their faces, they will be able to scare the Russians and they will stop. So maybe that was the plan. But that plan was discovered. The Russians understood immediately that this brigade doesn't have anything, doesn't have nothing to stop, to show the Russians. And they attacked, they pushed in this direction. And now you see what we see. The Western source map shows about encirclement of Paraskoviivka and Krasnogora. So I believe that within the next few days, this entire bridgehead will be collapsed. And if this bridgehead are collapsed, then Bakhmut will appear in operational encirclement immediately. So this is the most important area, and we'll follow this situation, what's going to be next. But also, when talking about the special military operation, Bakhmut is not the most important bridgehead. By the end of this day, by the end of 8th of February or maybe 9th of February, the Russians, beginning of 9th of February according to the local time, the Russians reported that by the evening of 8th of February and the beginning of 9th of February of local time, the Russians activated their artillery duels or artillery preparation in Sumi region, in this area. And nobody can tell exactly what the Russians are planning to do. Nobody can say anything, but some military experts are saying or making some conclusions that these artillery preparation, these artillery attacks might be some kind of artillery preparation before greatest Russian offensive operation in direction of Sumi, Kremenchuk, in this area. Who knows? We'll see. I believe that tomorrow we are going to receive more details about this area, and we are going to see whether that was a fake attack or the real attack. If this attack is fake attack, then when talking about Ukrainians, there are no thing to worry about. But if this operation is real, this might be a real problem for the Ukrainians, because if you remember, we discussed possible attacks from Zaporozhye, about some possible attacks from Bakhmut in direction of Slavyansk, about some possible attacks from Belgorod to Izum. And just once we discussed the situation in Sumi, and this is a very crazy attack, and it's very interesting attack, because if the Russians are able to develop progress in this area, and you need to understand that attack in direction of Sumi, let's return back to the Western sources map. This is Sumi. If the Russians are planning to do a real offensive operation in this area, they are able to achieve a lot. They will be able to cut a lot of railroads that connects Kiev and Kharkiv, and this can. The thing is that the Ukrainians don't have a lot of manpower, a lot of power in the vicinity of Sumi just to stop the Russians. And the Russians, by this attack, will be able, I believe that, to develop bridgehead, something like this, with even low power, low forces. Because there are no forces from the Ukrainian side to stop them. And if the Russians are able to develop this bridgehead, just you can see on the map, they will be able to do a lot. And they will be able to stretch the Ukrainian forces, and they will force the Ukrainians to move the reserves from Bakhmut in the area of Sumi. And it's very difficult to understand what the Ukrainians are planning to do, how to stop the Russians. And it might be the first page of the chapter of the book of the collapse and ending of the Ukrainian army, or something like this. So we'll see. Anyway, within the next few days, we're going to understand everything, whether that information was some kind of speculation or it was true, who knows. But for now, we see what we see. The Russians have progress. The Ukrainians are collapsing very slowly, but they're collapsing. And for now, they don't have anything to stop the Russians. But another important thing that I mentioned, that when talking about the Ukrainians, you also need to understand this. That situation all over the front lines during these days remind me the situation in Ukraine on May or June of the previous year. If you remember, at some point of special military operation, the Ukrainians took a decision to remove all their professional army from the front lines. They removed their army from Slavyansk, Lysychansk, from Kupiansk, from Kharkiv, from Kherson area, and they replaced every single unit of their professional army with the territorial defense. And those territorial defense forces made the most important job. They stopped the Russians, and they forced the Russians to focus on them and to spend time before reducing those territorial defense forces. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians' main forces were trained, were prepared, were accumulating on different front lines before the Ukrainians started their own counteroffensive operation. So these days we can see the same picture, Now, all of the front lines, the Ukrainians are trying to replace very powerful, well-trained forces and forces with experience with the territorial defense forces. In Vuhledar, in Bakhmut, in Artyomovsk, in Kupiansk, Lyman. Meanwhile, they're moving their main forces in the back to fulfill, to replace, and maybe this is the part of Ukrainian preparation before the Ukrainian greatest offensive operation. Who knows? The situation is very complicated, but when talking about facts, the Russians are pushing, and they have almost finished encirclement of Paraskoviivka and Krasnaya Gora. And from this encirclement, there's going to be maybe another chapter in this military special operation, and we're going to see this within the next few days. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.